I might start firstly with an acknowledgement of country. Can I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm coming to you from, the people of what has become known as Canberra, but Ngunnawal and the Ngambri country. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded in Australia, and what was Aboriginal land remains Aboriginal land. We have a big decision this year, and the Edmund Rice Centre is a strong supporter of the yes vote and the process going forward in terms of the outcome that we're looking to see this year with the referendum. Can I welcome everybody, especially our guests, the Honourable Ralph Regenvanu and Vishal Prasad. The Honourable Ralph Regenvanu, and also, sorry, all of those who are joining you. I've just got a sign in front of me, sorry. Got it, okay. The Honourable Ralph Regenvanu is the current Minister for Climate Change, Meteorology and Geohazards, Energy, Environment and Disaster Risk Management. He's also an anthropologist and artist, and for many years was a director for the Vanuatu Cultural Centre before entering politics. Vishal Prasad is a campaigner for the Pacific Island students fighting climate change and has been involved with the campaign since 2020. Vishal was one of those students, and correct me if I'm wrong, who was part of the movement that led to the outcome that we saw last week. And we're very, very glad to have both the Honourable Ralph Regenvanu and Vishal on today, both who have been part of that process that led to such an incredible decision being made at the UN, and which we'll hear more about today. Just for everyone's information, the Edmund Rice Centre works to promote human rights, social justice, and eco-justice through research, community education, advocacy, and networking. Our priority areas include First Nations people and reconciliation in Australia, refugees and people seeking asylum, and those in the Pacific affected by climate change. For tonight's order of proceeding, both speakers will have a discussion with my teammate and coordinator of the Pacific Calling Partnership, Corinne Fagure, followed by the opportunity for question and answers, which we will draw from those we receive from the chat. Can I remind people to mute yourselves during the event and turn off your camera if you do not wish to be seen. I would like to also remind everyone that tonight's event will be recorded, and we intend to publish it as part of our social media and website. So if you don't want to be seen on that, please turn your camera off, and we'll ensure that you aren't in shot for that purpose. Finally, can I ask people to write their questions for Ralph and Vishal into the chat? As mentioned, we'll have about 15 minutes for question and answers after the discussion. But from there, I'd like to pass on to Corinne to start the conversation. Corinne, over to you.
Thanks a lot, B. And welcome everybody, and especially to our guests, Ralph and Vishal. A very warm welcome to you, and a heartfelt congratulations for this wonderful achievement. There is much work to be done yet, but on the 29th of March, after a 3-year campaign, the United Nations General Assembly, by consensus, passed Vanuatu's resolution to seek an advisory opinion on climate change and human rights and the obligations of governments across the globe from the International Court of Justice. This is a huge achievement that required an incredible amount of work by grassroots activists and by the Vanuatu government. And we are all indebted to you for that, because as we will see, this decision is relevant to us all. Vishal, can I start by asking you, you were there right at the beginning. Can I start by asking you how all this started and how you got involved?
Thanks, Corinne. Very good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be joining you all for this webinar and speaking to you about the Advisory Opinion campaign. Where it all started, I think, and sorry, I also like to just correct Alopi as well. I wasn't part of the initial 27 students that did start this campaign. I joined a few months later. But this whole campaign began in a university classroom in Vanuatu. It was a University of the South Pacific class on international environment law. And then there was this exercise about trying to understand or find ways in which international law could help be a vehicle to accelerate climate action and really to get us moving. And one of the options that did come out was an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, and there was a lot of interest in this. And then after some research, after considerations, and then back and forth, a lot of the students were interested in asking, okay, maybe we should take this forward and ask our leaders to see whether they'd be interested. This seems like something that could be very powerful. No one's talking about it at the moment, and maybe let's just ask. And so initially, the students wrote letters to all Pacific leaders, and at that point, there was the first favorable response came from the government of Vanuatu. Minister Regenvanu was then Minister for Foreign Affairs, and the students. There was a team of students that visited his office, and everyone was very heartened to hear the first positive response that, okay, the Vanuatu government would consider this, and so that was the very beginning, from there it was we looked at how can we mount a civil society campaign, a really grassroots campaign behind this, and really advocate for this, because it was very apparent from the very beginning that if there was any chance for this campaign, there would need to be global support for this. And so from the very beginning, we understood that this campaign would need to rise from the Pacific and go global as well. And so I think at that time, our first milestone was trying to get the Pacific Islands Forum leaders to understand and support this campaign and get behind this campaign. And in 2019, the Pacific Island Forum, in the outcomes document, they noted the campaign positively. They said they noted the need for an advisory opinion, and we moved forward. We weren't happy with that. We really wanted them to go beyond noting this, to endorse the campaign, and so our campaigns continued on from there to really urge Pacific leaders. There were different forms this campaign took, and maybe we could discuss that later on. But in 2022, the Pacific Island Forum formally endorsed the campaign, which then was probably a domino effect into what led to further endorsements from other countries and other regions of the world. But in a nutshell, I think the very beginning of this campaign was in a classrooms, then from students and from really the Pacific rising up and taking ownership of this.
Beautiful, thanks, Vishal. And from your perspective, Ralph, how was it to get this letter from these students, and where was Vanuatu at, and what led to your decision to take on this campaign on behalf of the Vanuatu government?
Well, I'm also an alumni of the USP Law School at MLS campus, so they were connections I had with that milieu. As well, of course, Vanuatu traditionally has been right at the forefront of ambitious climate action. Way back in the 1980s, we were a founding member of AOSIS, the Association of Small Island States, which is now the most ambitious bloc in the UNFCCC negotiations on climate change. We were in fact a founding member and the inaugural chair of that of AOSIS. And way back in the early 90s, as the chair of AOSIS, we were the first country to call for loss and damage, for recognition of this term, loss and damage fund. So the trajectory is sort of from there. And my background is civil society advocacy before I got into politics. So when I saw this letter coming from students of my old, school, and an issue that was central to Vanuatu's foreign policy, the idea of ICJ opinion, advisory opinion, was something that was around, but like everyone thought it was totally outlandish. There was no way it would ever happen. It was just something. The students came forward with that idea, and as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, I thought, well, why not? Let's just try. And so we did a cabinet paper to get a position from the government of Vanuatu on it, that we would take it up to the level of the forum. And I remember in July 2019 was the Pacific Island Forum Foreign Ministers meeting in Suva, which is a prelude to the leaders meeting. So you have the senior officials meeting. And so we fed it into that level, and then it came up to the foreign ministers. And I was able to defend it and make sure it went up to the leaders. It was referred up to the leaders. When it got to the leaders meeting in August 2019 in Tuvalu, we encountered resistance. And particularly there was particular resistance from Pacific Island countries. And the resistance was that there was a fear that taking this trajectory would undermine the UNFCCC negotiation process. So the COPs that were happening, which were countries talking to each other, there was a fear that taking a direction to get an advisory opinion from the ICJ was almost like you're saying, okay, well, we've had enough of talking, now we're going to go to court. And that has been, in fact, one of the biggest reservations we've had to overcome in getting countries to support this idea. And that's why, as Vishal said, the leaders, the communique that came out of the Pacific Island Forum Leaders Summit in Tuvalu was only able to note the Vanuatu initiative and wasn't at the stage of actually endorsing it and having all Pacific Island countries saying, we will back this initiative. So and then it went on from there. But that's how it came into and I think it was a mixture. I mean, this whole ICJ campaign, the success of it, a lot of things that are successful is just like timing, the right timing, at the right time, the right person. And that's what I think this was in the initial stage, because I was the person in the foreign ministry with my own background receiving this, and I was able to just push it on.
Amazing. And I mean, not only was it successful, but it was incredibly successful that the resolution didn't go to a vote. And you had how many host countries, how many countries actually that became hosts for this resolution? 130, or is that right?
Yes. Prior to the UNGA session on the 29th of March, which was when the resolution was adopted, there were already 121 countries who were co-sponsoring. And then when the resolution was presented on the floor, another, I think it was 11 countries. So we got up to 132, 133 co-sponsors before we were even discussing it. And so out of 193 countries in total, that's more than 2/3 co-sponsoring.
That's incredible. I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, timing and circumstance, and also a large part of that success was the decision in early 2022 to form a core group of countries to work with Vanuatu on producing the question. And so the text of the question was always going to be the contentious thing. What are you asking? And what are the legal consequences of asking these kinds of questions, right? So we knew that we had to get acceptance from the world for whatever text was produced. We had the Blue Ocean Law Company from Guam was retained by the government of Vanuatu, and they'd been doing a lot of research the previous year or 2 years in trying to find exactly the right question. And so we had the perfect text that we wanted. And then at the beginning of last year, 2022, we made the decision to then invite 17 other countries to join a core group, which would then work on that text. And so that core group was drawn from all areas of the world. We had African countries, we had European countries, we had rich countries, we had poor countries. All areas of the world were represented. And that was a conscious effort to try and make sure that each region's concerns were brought into the question, were reflected and were discussed. And those core group members could also go back and discuss with their region about this. And I think that was a very, and that was a key strategy in terms of getting this ownership, because we had New Zealand, and then we had Germany, Liechtenstein, Romania, countries in Latin America, countries in the Indian Ocean. So trying to bring everyone on board, develop this feeling that we're all together in this, and then getting that feeling out through the various diplomatic channels as well. And I think also a conscious effort to have inter-government organizations support it. So you get a large number of commitments at one time. So I just want to say that from this history, it wasn't the Pacific that first endorsed this. It was in fact CARICOM, the Caribbean countries, were the first regional bloc to say, we will support this. The Pacific came on afterwards.
Interesting, really interesting to hear the development of the campaign and this important, strategic decision that you made to develop ownership of the question early on. Before I ask the next question, I just want to remind people that they can go to the bottom of the screen and press chat and put their question in if they want, because we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions from the floor. Ralph, and Vishal, I was going to ask you a little bit more about this question. And could you give us a little bit more detail and insight into what exactly are you asking? Are you seeking an advisory opinion on from the International Court of Justice?
Vishal, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. I could go ahead and maybe just briefly talk about from the very beginning of this campaign. We were very interested in two themes that we wanted the ICJ to respond to in providing its advisory opinion. One was the idea of human rights and the protection of human rights, and the second, that of intergenerational equity, that this is not just about present generations, but future generations as well, and the need to protect their rights from the impacts of climate change. And I think at the very heart of the legal question, you would see this reflected. It talks about two things, essentially clarifying the obligations of states under international law in protecting the rights of current and future generations and the climate system. So a whole host of looking at the whole host of international law in order to determine what are state obligations and what these responsibilities are. And second is a question that talks about that really goes beyond, which was a great thing, and that talks about what are the legal consequences under these obligations of states. And so I think that did go beyond what we initially thought to just provide clarification, but the question put before the court now is even more ambitious in asking for what the legal consequences in this case under the obligations that have been identified.
So what if, first of all, do you have a sense of the timeline as to when the International Court of Justice might produce an advisory opinion on the questions?
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
sorry, just to mention, the ICJ will provide a timeline. So after the resolution has been adopted, it'll be communicated to the ICJ. We'll consider this request, and once accepted, the ICJ will provide a timeline. Historically, on average, advisory opinions have taken somewhere between 1.5 to 2 years for the court to deliver, and so we think it could be around that time, 1.5 to 2 years, but definitive time would be available to us by the ICJ once it communicates the timeline.
Can you give us an insight into the work involved between now and the time that the ICJ actually hands over its opinion on the questions asked? What happens now?
There will be, it's like a court hearing now, which many of us are familiar with. There will be a call for submissions, and states can make submissions, and intergovernmental organizations can make submissions, and the submissions will go in, and then they'll be provided to all parties, and then there'll be a response, a second round of submissions responding to other states' submissions. And then, of course, witnesses will be called by various parties who are basically states or intergovernmental organizations to testify, provide evidence. There's a very a clearly set out way in which the court deals with submissions, time-wise and order-wise and that kind of thing. And then after the second round of submissions, then basically the court will retire to consider its, and then it will hand down, I believe initially a draft advisory opinion, and then a final one. And so the work now will be for states to prepare submissions. There will of course be a lot of collaboration and cooperation between states to make sure that submissions go a certain way. For example, we will be working closely with Pacific Island states to make sure that we all collaborate in how we approach the court and what we say and the submissions that we make. But there already is a large body of work, research information about the subject matter. And so it's a lot of legal preparation of the arguments based on available evidence to go into submissions.
Okay, so lots of work ahead.
Yes.
What do you see as the potential implications for climate justice and for loss and damage? And I think it would be helpful to outline for the audience what loss and damage actually is, because not everyone's familiar with that concept. But it is a core part of climate justice. And so I wanted to ask you, what do you see could be the potential implications of a favourable advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice on climate justice, and particularly on loss and damage claims? Vishal or Ralph?
Thanks, Corinne, for that. I think from our perspective, the advisory opinion is a very powerful tool, and we see it really as a catalyst. We are at the moment looking at climate responses and climate action. The IPCC report is painting a very bleak picture for what's ahead, and there is really a need for us to accelerate climate action, climate ambition, and we're not doing that if we were to objectively look at that. And so there is really a need for a catalyst to help break these deadlocks, these impasses that we have. And part of that deadlock and impasse is because of a lack of clarification under international law on what states should be doing and what their obligations are. And so an impact, one of the major impacts of the advisory opinion that we see is that it could really help ratchet up ambition, because it can also plug in the gaps that we have under the Paris Agreement, for example, that relate to ambition and accountability, for instance. And when we look at clarifying state obligations, not just through the lens of the Paris Agreement, but through the whole host of international law that is including human rights treaties and conventions, you have a much more holistic understanding of state obligations, and that can really help provide states with the guidance that's needed, and also for states to be held accountable to. So essentially is a yardstick to help monitor state compliance to what the obligation should be. And then that can really help build climate justice. For us, the framing of looking at it through the human rights and intergenerational equity perspective is really the essence of climate justice, because we're looking at people at the heart of it, and their lived realities and what they are going through as a result of climate change. And so an opinion that accounts for this and that includes the rights of people really will help advance climate change. And it will have far-reaching implications for policy, for domestic litigation, etc., because it will be a clarified and probably the most clarified and authoritative statement coming out from the court on state obligations and state and consequences of states.
Thanks, Vishal. Ralph, do you want to comment on loss and damage specifically, perhaps, particularly in the context of Vanuatu? And what is this concept of loss and damage, and how that can you give us an illustration through what is happening in Vanuatu at the moment?
So there's three actions or responses to climate change. Mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. Mitigation is when you take measures to reduce emissions, for example, by switching to renewable energy. You're trying to mitigate the effect of emissions on the global climate. And renewable energy is the best example of that, really, trying to move away from fossil fuels and greenhouse gas emitting energy sources and go to renewable energy. And adaptation is just what it says, trying to adapt to the effects of climate change. So making changes in the way you build seawalls, for example, having to build seawalls to adapt to rising sea levels and that kind of thing. Loss and damage is when you've done all that, but you still, it's not sufficient to stop great loss, great damage and destruction to communities, to public infrastructure, to ways of life, people having to move from their homes to other areas. So when there's really a loss that is something that needs to be recognized as, this is something that we have lost, the damage to the property and infrastructure is a direct result of climate change. And it's the idea that that also has to be factored into international action. You have to deal with that. You have to pay for that. And who's going to pay for it? So of mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage is the one with the clearest climate justice aspect, because it's about, loss is like, classically in law, loss results in a tort, right? It's you then go to court to get compensation for that loss that you have suffered at the hands of somebody. And so it's interesting that, and once again, fortuitous timing, we get this advisory opinion agreed upon by the UNGA that it will go to the court. At the same time as we're negotiating this loss and damage fund, which was agreed upon at last year's COP, and the fund will be finalized by this coming COP. Loss and damage and ICJ are very, very closely tied together, because the ICJ advisory opinion is on climate justice, and loss and damage is a climate justice issue.
So are you saying that the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, if it is a favorable opinion, could actually make it easier to obtain loss and damage compensation for vulnerable countries?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Thanks for that. I'm sure that we'll have other questions around the details of the ICJAO, but I wanted to ask you before I open it up to the floor about other initiatives led by the Pacific, because this isn't the only one. The Pacific has led the way now for many years in international global diplomacy. And there are a number of other initiatives, such as the Fossil Fuel-Free Pacific Initiative and the Port Vila Agreement, recently signed a few weeks ago, I think. Can you give us a summary or some more details about the range of initiatives in the space of climate change in the Pacific at the moment?
So it's interesting to note that this request for an advisory opinion is in fact not the first request for an advisory opinion from a state. We do have one that is already in train, which is the COSIS, the Commission of Small Island States. Antigua and Barbuda and Tuvalu are leading that. It's requesting an advisory opinion from the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Almost exactly the same question we are asking the ICJ, like what are the obligations of states under the law of the sea to prevent climate harm, to prevent emissions that heat the ocean in other countries' territories, right? That cause climate change. So that is an initiative that Tuvalu, for example, is one of the members of that. And Vanuatu also joined last year, that coalition of countries. And that advisory opinion is going to come before the ICJ advisory opinion. So it'll obviously feed into it. We have the Latin American countries pursuing also an advisory opinion from the Inter-American Court on climate issues as well, which will also be decided before the ICJ. So both of these will have a significant impact on that final decision. The Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, as you say, Tuvalu and Vanuatu were the first movers in terms of states saying they will advocate for this treaty as states. The president of Vanuatu in last year's United Nations General Assembly announced Vanuatu's support for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And at COP last year, both Tuvalu and Vanuatu stepped up. And now, as a result of this meeting we had last month, in the middle of March in Vila, we now have Tonga has signed up as well, Fiji, Niue, to push this idea of having a treaty that sets a clear pathway for reducing, phasing out of fossil fuels exploitation, providing for a just transition, which means, once again, a climate justice issue, providing resources to countries like the vulnerable countries of the Pacific to assist them to transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energies, and also setting up mechanisms whereby you can monitor and measure performance in terms of phasing out of fossil fuels. And one particular outcome which we are now going to pursue is establishing a Pacific Energy Commissioner for a just transition to a fossil fuel free Pacific. We're hoping that the forum leaders will endorse that in October. In the meantime, we have a series of other regional fora, and also at the Climate Action Summit before the UNGA, Vanuatu and Tuvalu will be hosting a ministerial dialogue to get other countries on. And so this is our next big diplomatic effort for Vanuatu, is to try and get this treaty with enough support that we start to build it out, develop it, start to see what it looks like, and get more and more states to commit to the extent that we can start having, for example, like the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. The state, you get to where you get the great majority of states signing up and agreeing that they will abide by the conditions, despite the fact that the nuclear weapon states don't agree with it. I think we can get to the stage where most countries, apart from maybe the the biggest fossil fuel producers, will be able to sign up to it, because it's about being transparent about how you are transitioning away from fossil fuels, and also pushing the highest ambition.
Thanks, Ralph. And of course, Australia is the third largest exporter of coal and gas in the world. How do you reconcile that with what you're trying to do? Australia is a big player in the Pacific.
This is going to be a question that we are going to raise once it's going to become pretty obvious once we start pushing the fossil fuel treaty at the level of the Pacific Island Forum. There will be a big issue with Australia. Papua New Guinea also is a fossil fuel producer, the only other fossil fuel producer in the Pacific. They need to work out where they stand in the Pacific, because the rest of the Pacific will be, I believe, will be very strongly in support of this. I remember coming back to the 2019 leaders communique coming out of the Pacific Island Forum Leaders Summit in Tuvalu. We got Australia to sign up to wording that was very strong. And that was the former government, the Liberal government, which was not very good on climate change. So Australia has also signed up to the Boy Declaration as a member of the Pacific Island Forum, which states that climate change is the single greatest threat to the security of the peoples of the Pacific. So we are trying to get Australia to be with us in terms of agreeing to these statements, but obviously it has to be reflected in domestic policy as well. And that's part of the angle. Like, if we can get them to commit at a certain level, we will ask them to follow through also with their own policies.
Thank you for that. One last question from me before we open it up to the floor. In the next 2 years, as the ICJ works through its deliberations and decision, how can NGOs such as the Edmund Rice Centre and many others support this process, best support this process? Any ideas?
Thanks, Corinne. I think as we move into phase 2 of the campaign, it's largely going to be about state submissions. That will be the main goal for this phase of the campaign, and we really are looking at ensuring that the most progressive arguments are presented to the court by states. And something that we're working on is what we call a Youth Climate Justice Handbook, and that is a collection of the most progressive arguments based on the current legal question that's been put to the court, and how and utilizing that handbook to convince states, or to include as a tool to convince states to include these in their submissions, and ensuring that the arguments and the themes that are so dear to the youth and civil society campaign, those of human rights and intergenerational equity, really come to the fore in the state submissions to the ICJ. And so a large part would be to ensure that these are in the more formal spaces, these arguments do go to the court, but also I think outside the court, there is a large role civil society can play in making sure that states, while they are engaging in the formal processes, that we make sure that they are aware that their people are watching and that they are aware of what is happening, and that this is an important climate justice campaign, and that we are watching them, and that there is a sizable pressure from outside that could influence what is happening inside as well. So I think there's a two-pronged approach to this. One on how we influencing decisions inside through connections through state submissions, and there can also be possibilities for intergovernmental organizations to support, and through our networks we could of course leverage that. But also I think increasingly there's a huge role that civil society and other organizations can play outside the court in making sure that this campaign stays at the center in the coming years, possibly.
Thanks, Vishal. Thank you both for your thoughts and allowing me to pick your brains. It's been an incredibly interesting conversation, and very grateful to get that information straight from you both, because you have been involved so closely with this. I'm now going to open it to the floor for any questions. If you have questions, please type them into the chat. We've got about 15 minutes for questions. So please, if you could put them in the chat now, and Alopi will be monitoring the chat.
Thank you, Corinne. I actually have a question from Leanne Brummel. Hope I've said that correctly, Leanne. I am part of Parents for Future Global. We have a letter for parents, grandparents, carers of children worldwide to sign calling for the fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. Is there something else the parent climate movement can do to help?
Well, we need all the pressure we can get applied, for example, in Australia on the Australian government, in the fossil fuel producing countries on the governments, to get them to stop fossil fuel extraction and move towards this, having no emissions. And really, for us in the Pacific, we have been saying this at all the COPs. We continually push for this to happen. But of course, the governments of the fossil fuel producing countries answer to their own constituencies, not to us. And so that's why it's so difficult. And that's why we've decided to take up the idea of going to the ICJ, because we have been in the climate negotiation spaces for like over 30 years, and the results are not what we want. Well, they're very disappointing. In fact, we're not getting, even after Paris, where we saw all the world agreeing to, keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees, agreeing to put a specific sum into the Green Climate Fund. I mean, those commitments were made and they haven't happened. And we're not seeing them happen. So it's almost like countries at the international level are not being faithful to what they said they would do, the agreements they've signed up to, the other United Nations agreements, human rights agreements. And one reason is it's not because of there's not any international pressure, because we're the international pressure, right? It's because maybe there's not enough pressure within the countries. And so I would encourage, all the citizens, including this Parents for Future Global. I mean, you have an enormous task convincing other parents, convincing neighbors, convincing your communities to, in any way possible, through the ballot box, through petitions, protests, whatever, to get this message out. And one thing that's heartening to see is the fact that this civil society pressure is growing so much all over the world, with numerous movements pushing governments for higher ambition. It just needs to happen much faster, as the IPCC report says. It just needs to happen like immediately. It needs to happen now. And so the more pressure, the better.
Okay, I've got another question from Samid Suleiman. To what extent are concerns about non-economic loss and damage factoring into your thinking on climate action and climate justice in the region and in terms of the UNFCCC process and the ICJ opinion?
Non-economic loss and damage is, of course, a large part of loss and damage. And it needs to be in the same way that the fund is being established now. We need to establish the mechanisms to deal with it. Loss of culture, loss of ability to access resources that are fundamental to our culture, which therefore affect our culture, our ability to continue to practice our ways of life. That's what we're seeing in the Pacific. You know, we have coastal communities who can no longer do the same things that their parents did because of the effects of climate change. And so you see changes in lifestyle, culture, values. It's, of course, there's a different matrix of calculation, but we are also working on those, right? We have in Vanuatu, we have a national well-being index that we developed ourselves that can measure quality of life. It can measure community vitality, this kind of thing. And so we can measure already any losses and changes that are happening in these fields. Access to customary land, which is one of the most salient or most predominant features of our cultures in the Pacific and all our nations in the Pacific, is we all have access to customary land, right? Which is the basis of our society, most of us. And that is being affected by climate change. And it affects our ability to enjoy our lives, right? So we are also working on those matrices as well.
Thank you, Ralph. I've got one probably for Vishal. Congratulations. This is from Yasmin Jarman, actually, one of my team members from Darwin. Yasmin works on our First Nations program, which is fantastic that she could be here tonight. But she says, congratulations for all your work for this victory. As a law student myself, can I ask your advice on getting young people and students organized and working together for advocacy? What worked well during the process for your group?
Thanks, Yasmin, for that question. And I think I've got that question a couple of times. And I think it hasn't always been easy. Mobilizations and grassroots campaigning is not always a smooth sailing. There are always ups and downs. But I think something that worked for us was always making the campaign accessible to people. And from the early days, of course, utilizing social media, websites, all of these things have been very useful for us. But a huge challenge that we had during the campaign was during COVID-19, when there was a lockdown, and really we couldn't campaign in the traditional sense of how campaigns would be going around. And so we had to go digital. And then I think in many ways, it helped the campaign become a lot more accessible to a lot more people. And so for young people, it's very difficult to get them to read a 20-page campaign brief or a long report because they doze off. And so we had to be innovative about making things like an animation explainer video for a campaign that was very legal, very technical, and that many people would not understand at first instance. So an animation explainer video, there were music videos that we created to get young people involved, participating in, of course, direct youth actions on the ground and getting students to participate. And also things like art competitions and all of those things. So those were some things that really got people's attention and then acted as a hook to get them involved. But I think also partnerships with other CSOs, youth networks and groups did work for us, because there was this existing infrastructure that we could tap into. There was already existing connections that were working well, and we just had to mobilize them in understanding the campaign and really getting them to understand that this could be valuable and that they could take this on. And so that also worked quite well for us. But it's also a learning curve for us. And there's always been things that have worked and also have not worked. So I guess we'll continue learning. But those were some ideas of what did work for us.
Thanks, Vishal. I've got a question from Hasmukh Chand. Hasmukh asks, Australia is keen to co-host a future COP. Wondering if there has been any thinking about what that would look like for the Pacific.
There have been very preliminary discussions about how Australia hosting a COP could be of benefit to the Pacific. I know our leaders last year at the Pacific Island Forum endorsed Australia's hosting of the COP. I wasn't in government then, so I don't know to what extent there was discussion of what the Pacific would get out of such a thing as a Pacific COP. I do know that I think we should be using a Pacific COP to get more ambition on fossil fuel reduction from Australia. And that is something that I've already been pushing, and I will continue to do so.
Okay, we've got another question from a little bit of a sort of discursive question from Benyon Law Online. Regarding fossil fuel on non-proliferation treaty, New Zealand is a fossil fuel exporter. Under current Labor government, it has stopped new offshore exploration, but existing permits continue to be extended. So hopefully relatively easy to pressure New Zealand to sign up. Is that in your plan?
Absolutely. New Zealand is, we consider that we have a lot of leverage with New Zealand in terms of these issues, and New Zealand is not so dependent as Australia is on fossil fuels, and so definitely we will be looking to get them to sign up to this fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty.
Vishal, I've got another one for you. Joseph Fernandez asks, in relation to the question about organising young people and students, there are various cases brought by young people, Juliana versus US being the most well-known. The Children's Trust, I think, runs them. Do you know what the latest status is?
Thanks, Joseph, for that question. I am aware of the case. I'm not too familiar what the latest developments on the case have been. Last I understand it was there was an attempt to, or they were trying to get it to trial, and there was a lot of hurdles that they were encountering on the way. But I'm not too familiar with where it is at the moment. But I think, again, the case is a perfect example, again, of young people and in different places, in different parts of the world, rising up to the challenge. We haven't really made connections with the team there, but I think it will be useful, and I think there could be synergies between their pursuit and this campaign as well.
Thank you, Vishal. I think actually that's a good point to finish up the questions, and there aren't any more, but there is a link to the ourchildrenstrust.org that Joseph's just posted. Can I thank you both really from what has been an amazing discussion. Thank you, Corinne, for being such a great facilitator tonight. And thank you all as an audience for being part of it. It's wonderful to see such a large turnout before the long weekend. I was actually a bit concerned we might get 3 or 4 people, but we have such a wonderful turnout. It's nice to see some old faces, Helen. Good to see you. Can I just say a couple of words? One is, and I forgot to mention this, we lost last week an amazing person in terms of the Edmund Rice Centre, Justice Michael Finane, who passed away. I think it was last week, wasn't it, Corinne? Justice Finane and his wife Jill have been instrumental in supporting the Pacific Calling Partnership and the work that has been part of our centre's work with the Pacific for the last near 16, 17 years, since 2007, I think. So it's been a big loss for us and a big point of mourning for us, as we've seen Michael. We went to Michael's funeral yesterday, and we just wanted to acknowledge his contribution, which was significant, both as someone who was committed to social justice, but also someone within the legal fraternity who often provided legal advice free of charge to many of those projects and programs that we worked with in the work that we did through the Edmund Rice Centre. I'd also like to thank Jafar, who's been sitting behind, making sure it all works properly tonight. Jafar is a wonderful member of the team, and he's always there supporting these events. We are looking forward to getting this program up, and thank you again for all agreeing. I didn't see any dissent from anyone to say that they were unhappy with us putting this online, so we will go forward with that. Lastly, can I put a little bit of a plug in for a podcast that we've just completed with the Honourable Ralph Regenvanu and the Honourable Seve Painu. And in fact, you have a preview if you want. It's actually on Spotify already. We're not going to put it out to the general public just yet, but if you wanted to listen to that, just look up Adjuster Generation on Spotify and you can have a listen to that podcast. It's our new podcast for the Edmund Rice Centre, and we look forward to getting some feedback, and also to you getting a chance to hear from some amazing voices from the Pacific. You've heard two of them tonight, and you'll hear one of them again on the podcast, but it's been great. I just saw from Hazel, I certainly sense that the majority of the Australian population are desperate for our government to take more action to reduce emissions, but it seems the government will still want to approve the opening of new coal and gas mines. It astounds me that when we see vision and horror and devastation being caused by catastrophic weather events, that the huge increase of these worldwide don't seem to reach their hearts. Thank you all for this very valuable webinar. Thank you. I think that's a good point to leave it. And goodbye to everyone. And we look forward to seeing you all at the next one, which will be just as exciting. So thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Vishal.
Thank you so much.
We'll talk to you soon.
Hello, P and everyone.
Thank you, everyone.